Hello, welcome to the special conversation that I'm having with Asmerom. This is the third part in a series of talks that I'm having in association with others who have been discussing the issue of the Tigray conflict in northern Ethiopia. We have seen that peace is often elusive when it comes to the situation unfolding in the region. Asmerom, you spoke with me in our correspondence about the prospect for peace and a negotiated settlement. What does that look like? How do you think it will have reverberations across the Horn of Africa? What are your thoughts in general?
Yeah, thank you, George. There have been things over the past few weeks that have suggested that there may be a peace deal underway, or that there's a great potential for it to actually happen. On the battlefield, as you know, the Tigrayan forces have completely retreated back to Tigray. From what I understand, they are not in the Amhara and the Afar regions anymore. They retreated a great distance. Many of that has been attributed to new drone technology purchased by the Ethiopian government. A lot of that also has to do with the logistical challenges that Tigrayan forces did face. But regardless of the reason, I think that that is representative of an actual opportunity for there to be some peace deal negotiation. I want to share an excerpt of an Economist article that I read recently about the conflict, in which they quoted a senior official. They didn't name the official, but they quoted a senior official in the Prosperity Party. And this is after the battlefield reverses suffered by the TPLF. But I'm just going to read this here. A more immediate risk is that Abiy, convinced victory is imminent, would decide to push again into Tigray rather than start talks. Officially, at least, such folly is not likely. Quote, "We don't think it is wise to go into Tigray, even if we can," says a ruling party official. "There's a general realization that we need a peace plan." This article was written in the middle of December. I think there's also another article by Africa News in which the president of the country, Sahle-Work Zawade, was quoted directly in relations to what a possible national dialogue might look like. I'm going to share that as well and read that aloud. Sahle said, "The situation in Ethiopia is stabilizing and that they will soon have a national dialogue. No war is simple as long as it is a war between us. There is no external occupation or external aggression, so it is a painful episode. But we are moving forward, the situation is stabilizing, and we'll still have a national dialogue that will determine the future of the country." Ever since then, we saw the release of political prisoners. This was something that was sold as sort of a Christmas gift to the opposition, as political opposition figures such as Eskinder Nega was released, Jawar Mohammed, Bekele Gerba. I mean, people with very large constituencies, but also among those released was Sebhat Nega, Abai Waldu, key figures in the TPLF. And what we've also seen is sort of a decline in the rhetoric that has been used at the beginning and throughout this conflict, labeling the TPLF as terrorist. I've noticed that decline significantly over the past few weeks. The word junta, which many people in Ethiopia decide to pronounce as junta, which is not how Spanish works. I think there's some real prospects for peace going on, and also, I mean, the army deciding not to penetrate into Tigray. Now, I think if they even think that they could, they wouldn't do it because of the astounding number of casualties they'll be taking to re-engage in a guerrilla war. But it seems like we're at a turning point, and I don't know if you heard just a few days ago, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said that there has been demonstrable efforts to bring this conflict into a peaceful end after having a conversation with Obasanjo, who is the unofficial mediator between the two parties. All of this is to indicate that maybe a peace deal has happened or may be happening. And we'll have to wait and see what this peace deal entails. I think that's sort of my reaction to the news over the past few weeks. I'd like to hear what you have to say, George.
Well, certainly some of the signs that we've witnessed in the past couple of weeks are promising in the sense that we're able to better ascertain the on the ground situation, I would say, because for many months, the Ethiopian government has not allowed any type of correspondence to enter into the region to actually do a complete observation and kind of a investigation as to the extent to which this war has permeated to society in the political sphere and the military sphere. So the release of political prisoners, journalists, these are good things, but we should also not co-sign that as saying that the conflict is on a trajectory towards peace entirely, due to the fact that there is still a presence of Ethiopian troops in Tigray to the extent that humanitarian aid cannot get in, which has, for almost the entire timeline of the conflict, has been the issue which people are raising the most concern about. Even though the Secretary General has given his sign of approval towards reconciliation, the people of Tigray are still starving needlessly, and as well as the Eritrean refugee population, who are at most risk due to the fact that the Eritrean troops at any time could go in and refoul them. And this has been an issue that we have to keep attention to. Essentially, we really need that to be the focus of the work for activism and peace. And I think in doing so, yes, we have to recognize that concessions need to be made. And in order for those sign-offs, for instance, the Ethiopian government lessening its use of the word terrorist to describe the TPLF, that can kind of cool down the tensions that have stoked over the past year and a half. Now, all of this is to say that the personally held beliefs of people cannot determine the outcome entirely of the political situation in the country, because that's really what's fueled the conflict from the beginning. So in order for peace to really be possible, first, the humanitarian crisis needs to be addressed with honesty. And until now, certain sides have not been honest or forthright in their acknowledgement of the humanitarian crisis. Most people are saying that Tigrayan forces are blocking all aid, and that's what's causing the issues in Tigray. And that's just not true. They have been trying to get in through different sides of the region, but they have not been able to. CNN did an investigative summary last summer. Going into Tigray was a difficulty for them. And it's mainly, I would just like to say that the aid is feared to go to these fighters. Really, that's why the Ethiopian government is blocking the aid, is they are trying to starve out the entire region so that the TDF will not have any access to aid. Now, it's a strategy, but it's not a viable one, because the people in the region are starving, literally have no resources to sustain themselves, and the medications that they need to continue their livelihood in a sense of normalcy has been stopped. So that, I would say, is the most pressing concern in order for peace to actually be possible, is to address the humanitarian crisis in a way where everyone acknowledges the reality on the ground instead of certain people believing a certain reality. Because I think uh, they're underestimating the severity of a lack of humanitarian resources in the region. Um, you probably heard last summer that Doctors Without Borders, Sans Frontières, three of their aid workers were killed without any trace of the assassin. You know, investigations into these crimes need to be started in order to find justice for the people who've been trying to do this work since before these recent developments that you've been speaking about. And that's not to say that the release of political prisoners and journalists and the release of detained Tigrayans is a bad thing. Yeah, I think it's a good thing. I also think that that needs to be coupled with other actions in a robust manner because let's just face it, I think the people are really the victims of this war. They really have not been able to express their opinion to the point where they are actually represented in government and they're heard by the Ethiopian administration running the country. And the people need a voice. And slowly over the timeline of this conflict, they've been turning to other parties that the government views as hostile, but nevertheless, that's what they've done as a way to assure their own uh, sustainment of resources. They need to find a way to get resources, and in order to do so, they choose to fight, which is not the best thing given the circumstances. So I think the the aspect of peace in this conflict, as we're recording this conversation, is opening, and I think it's a good thing. But I'd like to know whether you feel the same way, whether the humanitarian crisis is something that needs to be at the forefront of any negotiation, because these sort of things cannot be uh, leveraged. The more that people wait on these resources to come in, more people will die. So how do you see that moving forward?
As you said just now, George, humanitarian aid is not something that can be bargained or leveraged. It is something that cannot be hindered under any circumstance. I recall seeing a tweet by the New York Times journalist and Bloomberg journalist Simon Marks, who said that there was a call between Prime Minister Abiy and the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, and that he essentially promised the Secretary General that he'll give better access to the UN to Tigray if Tigrayan forces pull out of the Amhara and Afar regions. I mean, this is just a blatant war crime. So that's obviously something that has to be addressed first as a humanitarian question. And a lot of that, quite frankly, is something that is in the control of Addis, of Arat Kilo, you know? I mean, all it takes is you could sort of flip a switch and then banking services would be restored in Tigray. They can flip a switch and restore communications. You know, that's sort of the downside of, you know, having such a centralized system, which is one of the many things that I've hammered the TPLF for years, is sort of maintaining the center power of Arat Kilo. And they did this routinely in the past. I mean, when there was unrest in Addis Ababa, internet was shut directly off from the capital itself. When there's a growing insurgency in Welaga and Oromia, communications and internet were shut off. So we see this pattern of the regime just using public services and humanitarian aid that they're not even paying for. All of this humanitarian aid is paid for by the international community. So the rhetoric we've been seeing from some people is that, oh, why should we provide this region with services and resources that the government paid for, or that is on behalf of the government? It's not. All that is being asked is for the government to allow what has already been paid for from the outside world in. And we've seen the federal government sort of hit back at the head of the World Health Organization, Tedros Adhanom, saying that he's biased and he's connected with the rebels and he wants them to win. And they're more than willing to accept WHO aid for the Amhara and the Afar regions, but they don't want to allow it to enter Tigray. And we all know why. And it's having a really devastating impact for so many people, including members of my own family. I have diabetic family members in Tigray. Have they run out of insulin? Probably. I hope not. Hope I get to hear from them when all of this is over, but there's no guarantee for that to occur. So humanitarian access needs to be granted immediately, absent of a peace deal. The peace deal should have ramifications on land, territory, ceasefire, but humanitarian access is not to be negotiated.
I absolutely agree. I think it's been probably the most heartbreaking, devastating aspect of the conflict, because these civilians had nothing to do with the fighting, in the sense that the Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, both of them can be criticized for how they've handled the governance of the country. But to have the civilians really pay the price for the conflict is really a saddening feature of this conflict. And it usually always falls on the people who suffer the most. It's not really the governments. Um, I was thinking back to the leadership of both parties to the conflict, and the only notable people I can really think of that have died from the Tigrayan side are Seyom Mesfin and Abai Tzahaya. And I'm not really sure anyone on the Ethiopian government side has uh, suffered any casualties. Of course, the Eritrean government has slowly suffered losses, some from old age, probably some from COVID-19, and probably some on the battlefield that we aren't aware of. And really, the ramifications of war are not felt at the level of leadership at all. And I think, in effect, they are out of touch with the reality on the ground, and that's allowing them to continue their uh, agenda of war as a means of extermination, to not only get rid of their rivals, but actually to eliminate them as an entity. And that is a full sum strategy. It's really a way to invigorate the people in such a way where they are convinced that they are under an existential threat. I mean, how many times have we heard that the only reason that there isn't peace is because of X party in the region? I mean, really it falls on the leadership to take responsibility when there's something wrong. But instead they deflect and they say, well, it's not all of our fault, or it's not our fault at all. Leaders really have to attune their speech in order to um, be concise and to also lay out the truth of the matter. And lying to people about the situation or trying to make excuses can only get you so far before people, even within your own government or within your own party, start to question you. I think the best example of this is the former Ethiopian Minister for Women and Children, Filsan Abdullahi Ahmed. She was in the government at the time when accusations were made of mass sexual violence against Tigrayan women. And she was still on the administration until October of 2021, when she resigned and came out subsequently afterwards with open critiques about the Ethiopian government's conduct in the war, saying that Tigrayan crimes were to be ignored, that the crimes committed against Tigrayans were supposed to be ignored, and that anything that happened by the TPLF was supposed to be overemphasized. And I think that is really a telltale sign of the extent to which scapegoating gets people far in politics when it comes to the Horn of Africa, because as much as you'd like to blame the TPLF for the things that they've done in the past, which I share in that criticism, I do think they have a lot to be held responsible for. It's uh, inconsistent, and it's also disingenuous to say that every single problem is caused by one party. There's very few exceptions to this rule. Maybe you can say the case for Eritrean dictatorship, but I make the point that the EPRDF was not just the TPLF, it was also other ethnic coalition parties, which included ones that Abiy himself was a part of. So I think another thing to really ask for when it comes to peace is not just humanitarian aid, but also to emphasize and to recognize uh, the fact that people did make mistakes. And I think for both sides, it's hard for them to really accept that their side, if we can say that, made mistakes. I would say we could just start off because you're from Tigray. In the case of the TPLF, they made a lot of blunders, politically speaking, that they probably are not remorseful about, and they've, to some extent, convinced their population that it was the right thing to do. Probably the most infamous one is when they did not leave the Eritrean town of Badme, and they kept their troops on the border for years without any accostation from the international community. Based off of the kind of polarity that exists within the political structure of the Horn of Africa, what would you say about the TPLF and their mistakes that they made leading up to the conflict?
So one thing to understand is that the TPLF and specifically the TPLF leadership, I mean, there are about 800,000 people in Tigray who are legally members of the TPLF as a political party, but I'm not necessarily referring to them. I'm talking about the leadership and the political culture that exists within that organization. I think they view themselves as extremely self-righteous, as if that they were the good guys for the past, 30 years. So I think if we want to talk about TPLF's blunders, I think we should first go back in time. Namely, I think one mistake now that I think most Tigrayans, including TPLF supporters, have really come to realize is maybe not pursuing independence in 1991. The momentum was there. The sort of the era of secessionism at such an important period in not only Ethiopian and Eritrean history, but also world history. This was 1991. This is when the Soviet Union was collapsed and we had new states springing about in Central and Eastern Europe. So I think not pursuing independence was a pretty, disastrous decision. I was watching a documentary yesterday. It was produced in part by the Relief Association of Tigray, REST, and it was published in about 1991, while Tigrayan forces were on their way to Addis Ababa, while Eritrean forces were on their way to liberating that part of the country. And it described sort of the Baito system, this communal democratic culture that was emerging amongst Tigrayan peasants that were actually facilitated by the TPLF, right? And it sort of it made me a bit nostalgic. I'm not gonna lie. This was when the war was winding down. This is when food aid was being distributed adequately throughout the then province. This was also the time in which new agricultural practices were being implemented. And it really showed the sort of the self-rule and the sort of the yearning by Tigrayans and by the then TPLF for political independence. However, when they reached Arat Kilo and assumed a major position in the federal government, that's when things have started to go a bit downhill. As you know, they had a short-lived alliance with the Oromo Liberation Front. They both came to agreement on the way that the regions, which were then provinces should be drawn up, and we saw new legal regions such as the Oromia region, which did not exist before 1991, right? Tigray province before 1991 did not include what is now considered Western Tigray. There was no Amhara region, there was no Somali region, but they were able to ally themselves with the OLF to change that and to sort of lay the foundation and the groundwork for self-determination amongst the many nationalities who lived in that country. But as they entrenched themselves in Arat Kilo and in power, they started to sort of abandon their natural allies. Many of these regions, as you know, the OLF was actually purged by the TPLF. Their camps were dismantled. Their members were persecuted and prosecuted, some killed even. The ONLF, the Ogaden National Liberation Front, actually had won an election in the newly created Somali region, but their power was then too stamped out. So I think this is one of the fundamental mistakes, to sort of go back on their principles and their creeds of self-determination, and to sort of create these satellite parties. Placing, for example, former prisoners of war into serious cabinet positions in return for their loyalty. I think, as you know, the current chief of staff of the Ethiopian army, Ethiopian military, is Birhanu Jula. He used to be a prisoner of war. I think he was captured in Eritrea, if I got that mistaken, if I'm not mistaken. Another one, Bacha Dembele, also a former prisoner of war of the EPLF in the 80s and 90s. These people now hold positions, and they've sort of turned the gun the other way towards their former captors, or towards their former wardens. As you said, whoever you think started the border war in 1998, I mean, the decision by the then Prime Minister Meles Zenawi to penetrate deep within Eritrean territory, and also the desire from the TPLF military leadership to try to annex Assab to give Ethiopia port access, and then followed up with the refusal to pull out of Badame and to occupy sovereign Eritrean territory for 20 years. And this is a great sticking point in the relations between the two countries. And the enmity just grew and grew between the TPLF leadership and the PFDJ leadership in Eritrea. We can point to the botched elections in 2005. I think that was pretty disastrous, and I think that laid the groundwork for a pretty authoritarian system that grew to be hated by all Ethiopians, regardless of their political leanings. As you know, there was sort of a Oromara alliance in the mid-2010s. We talk about the Kero movement that ultimately dislodged the TPLF from Addis Ababa and brought Abiy Ahmed to power. They were also allied with many Ethiopianist nationalists. I mean, Ginbot 7. I mean, you had sort of the OLF being trained in Eritrea by the PFDJ, and also Birhanu Mega being trained in Eritrea by the PFDJ. So there was sort of an alliance that crossed ideological lines, simply directed towards the TPLF. And I think their inability to, capture, and their inability to make important concessions and to actually fulfill the promises that they made to not only their own constituents, but to who would have been their potential allies throughout the country. So what we see now is, after 17 years of armed struggle, 27 years in federal power, and after 3 short years, I mean, Tigray is surrounded by all sides, everyone getting their piece of quote unquote revenge. And who pays for it the most? The Tigrayan people themselves. And I think that's been the greatest tragedy of them all. And even after 2018, when Abiy rose to power, I mean, they did not take being ejected from Arat Kilo, I think, in the healthiest way. As you know, in the fall of 2018, an arrest warrant was issued against the former spy chief of the country, for the role that he played in, I think, very violently suppressing the protests that went on in Oromia. The TPLF sheltered him and actually elected him to the board position within the TPLF political bureau. So relations between Addis and Ma'ala began to deteriorate, and I think I think they've I think they may have made a lot of. I think they deeply regret the way that they handled um, the last 30 years. But where do you see it though, as an Eritrean? I mean, I know a lot of transgressions between against the TPLF that Eritreans have, whether it be the deportations in the eve of the border war, the occupation of Badame. And I also see that in Eritrea, the TPLF is sort of like a scapegoat as to why the country can't do X or Y. So maybe you can talk about, I'd like to know, where do you see things as a pro-justice Eritrean?
Well, I think the last point that you made about scapegoating political actors is probably the most important aspect of how the regime has been able to survive for so long. Because the PFDJ regime in Eritrea has externalized their internal failures by saying that the country is not in a position to develop because of another country's political group. And to an extent, that point can be understood. For instance, you mentioned the isolation that Eritrea faced as a result of the uh, border dispute in Badme. And I understand that the Ethiopian government at the time was very robust and actually during the Bush administration was a key ally for the United States to engage in counterterrorism efforts, as well as peace and security. And Eritrea was fundamentally opposed to it simply because they were anti-Ethiopian uh, in their policy. So I understand that sentiment to an extent. The problem is when they take it too far and they violate the rights of Eritreans inside Eritrea, which is where I come from, because that really affected a lot of people and it manipulated the conversation on the TPLF into something about Tigray. And they're conflating these two. They're conflating Tigray and the Tigray region and the people with the political party. And now you start to see vitriol among some Eritreans who deeply hate, and I use that word sparingly, but I think it's correct in this context, hate Tigrayans just because of where they're from. They don't even, you don't even know if somebody supports one party or the other. You just hate them because they are this ethnic group or this religion or this language speaker. It creates a cycle of animosity with people. And again, I'm not saying every person feel this way, but I think it's prominent enough to mention because when will this end? The peace deal, the so-called friendship agreement that was signed in 2018 was supposed to eliminate all of these crises. But the problem was, in part, the Tigrayan people were not involved in those initial talks. It was just between Abiy and Isaias. And even Abiy and Isaias's political allies within their respective governments were not even aware of how much relationship between the two countries would foster. And again, I guess we're seeing that today in the conflict in Ethiopia. So I think it's really important to emphasize that in order for peace to really be at the forefront of the region, all people need to be involved. All actors need to have a say in the future of the region, regardless of how we feel about them. We need to accept that they are there, unless they're not. And in the war that we've seen, none of the parties really seem to want to leave. They're not defeated easily. They have reasons to fight. They're motivated to do so. And whether we think it's right or wrong is irrelevant, honestly, because they're there. There's no one there to oppose the Prosperity Party. There's no one there to oppose the TPLF, and there's no one there to oppose the PFDJ. As much as we would like to see reform, unfortunately, we have to work with what we have. And I think uh, perhaps this is a point adjacent to the topic of peace, but also leadership, uh, the age of these people. You know, how many years has uh, uh, before he became prime minister, how many years did Meles Zenawi serve under the guerrilla wing of the TPLF? And then afterwards, when he became the prime minister, I mean, he was there for decades. When you don't leave a very strong infrastructure within your institutions, a very regimented system, you know, it's going to fall apart. And I think that's one of the reasons why the TPLF was not able to hold on for power for so long. You mentioned the 2005 elections. Actually, I would say the 2015 elections were worse because according to a ranking, which measures the freedom of elections throughout the world, the Ethiopian election in 2015 was rated the least free in the entire world. And that shows the extent to which the EPRDF inculcated corruption into its messaging and its management of the country. And in order for us to move on from that, first we need new leadership, and we also need the leaders to recognize that this current situation is not viable. It's not a tenable way to facilitate a country in terms of economic policy, in terms of public policy, in terms of health policy. I mean, have we ever talked about the COVID-19 pandemic and its ramifications on those in Tigray? I personally haven't seen many articles cover that because these leaders really are not concerned with the safety of citizens. They're just concerned about how to achieve longevity in the political atmosphere in order to, again, reach out to other governments. We're seeing now the Ethiopian government of today is reaching out to China and saying that the TPLF is a agent of the United States. Well, who built the African Union headquarters? The Chinese government did under the TPLF-led coalition of the EPRDF. So these governments are just rotating. Really, the outside players that are observing what's happening in Ethiopia could not care what the political reality of the situation of the country is. They just want someone to work with. And if they see that the Ethiopian government is stronger, they will work with them. If they see the TPLF is stronger and actually overthrows the government, they'll probably work with them as well. I think we also have to understand that it's just purely interest driven. Who will do the best under the current circumstances? Right now, it's probably the Ethiopian government because of the drones. They have a significant advantage in terms of military. And those drones are negatively contributing to the hopes for peace because many civilians have died and the government will not really speak out that much about its misconduct when it comes to air warfare. I don't really need to say much about Eritrea because they hardly ever talk about the war in Tigray. They didn't even acknowledge that their army was in the region until a very subtle line of admission in June of 2021 in a little address. So in saying all of this, I think we really need to understand that an acceptance of reality needs to set in before we can really talk about peace. We can say that the release of prisoners, the movement for talks is a good thing, but until the actual governments are aware of this and actually see that there's no military solution to the conflict, then and only then will we be able to fully realize the damages that have been done. I don't really think any side to the conflict has really taken the toll or really have seen the toll of war. I think these are battle-hardened people like General Saad Khan. He's a very experienced war general who probably has seen carnage throughout his life, and he's not phased by any of the fighting happening. And the same in Eritrea. Um, you mentioned that the incursion by the Ethiopian military into Eritrea and the deportations were a great source of pain for Eritrea, and that is true. And I think the response by fighting and actually uh, being hostile in response is kind of just a natural reaction. Whenever you are attacked, you have to defend yourself, which is, to an extent, it's understandable and it's also necessary. But the way in which uh, they've responded since then, by instituting military service indefinitely, by militarizing education, by uh, cracking down on civilian freedoms and rights, that goes into a separate territory of violating people's freedoms. And in a civilized country, that just can't happen. You can't use a military situation to suppress the rights of people. And I think that's what we've seen in Ethiopia, especially in the lapse of the conflict. And it's kind of a repeat of what's happened in Eritrea for so long. And that's one of the reasons why, even though I am hopeful for peace, it's just I'm not sure if it'll ever come to fruition unless all the parties acknowledge that they need to stop the war because their human resources are gone. They're being depleted. Their economic resources are dwindling. They're having to reach out to more more risky sources of revenue. So all of this is to say, uh, the the prospect for peace is not simply due to one aspect of the situation. I think we have to weave in all of these threads together to understand the full picture of how peace can be established based off of the circumstances of today. Um, Perhaps I didn't answer your question in full, but I guess I just wanted to say that as an Eritrean, because most Eritreans that I speak with or I read their writing really centers around a definite end to the TPLF as a party, which I can understand, as well as the permanent suspension of the PFDJ. But that doesn't go far enough. They also need to say that both parties need to acknowledge their faults and their mistakes. They're the people fighting in the war, you know. The people of Eritrea and the people of Tigray probably don't really have any conflict with each other. I'm talking about the native population. I'm not talking about the diaspora. These people were so jovial in 2018 when the border opened. You could see the rejoice and the appreciation of each other, the embrace that each of the peoples had, and whether or not it was based off of a real uh, call for peace or a genuine appeal for reform is, I think it's irrelevant at this point. But you could see that both Tigray and Eritrea were willing to come together to reconcile on their differences, not to forget them, but to make amends. But now this war has completely uh, eliminated that possibility, at least in the short term, because the leaders of both Tigray and Eritrea, and even to an extent Ethiopia, are not willing to settle on half measures. They want to go all the way. And you know, the rhetoric coming from each of the sides, especially I think from the Ethiopian side in this sense, is disturbing. You know, Prime Minister Abiy said, "We will bury them in their blood and bones." The Eritrean government said that the TPLF is a cancer that needs to be removed. A lot of Tigrayan Defense Force generals have said that they need to eliminate the regime in Asmara and Addis Ababa and overthrow them. So it's bellicose rhetoric, and yes, it's an all sides kind of issue, but when we really observe it, it's also, you know, who is really responsible for what's happening. And I think when you're in charge of the federal government, you have more of a responsibility to manage the crisis of the country. And maybe in this sense, the Ethiopian government has more responsibility. Um, but perhaps something that we don't really talk about that often is, how do you think, uh, if peace were to happen in the short term or in the long term, what would that look like in a post-war situation? What do you think are really the steps that would happen after peace occurs, or what do you think would happen during that process?
Well, I think a big hindrance to peace, at least, is the issue of Western Tigray, as the Amhara regional state has effectively annexed and ethnically cleansed these territories. Um, so there has to be a resolution for that. I mean, there are still tens of thousands of Tigrayan fighters who have been looking to the west, to the western part of Tigray as a key military objective. And I seriously believe if there has to be a peace process, I don't think the TPLF will settle for anything but the pre-war borders that were established. I mean, Western Tigray is, for many reasons, very strategic. It's an outlet to Sudan, which is a friendly, neutral country, foreign country, which also has a port. It's an outlet to pretty fertile territory in that area. A very large sesame industry had emerged over the past few years in these areas. The sites of brutal massacres, especially Maikadra, of mainly Amhara civilians, but also Tigrayan civilians as well. So, I mean, a peace, I think, and to be quite frank with you, I don't think Abiy is in a position to sort of make a concession on Western Tigray, because quite frankly, he doesn't control it. There are very few federal forces in Western Tigray. It's mostly Eritrean and Amhara regional forces. Um, and I quite frankly, I don't think the issue of Western Tigray animates the entire country. I think it's a very small portion of sort of the Amhara nationalist base. But other than that, I think the vast majority of the country is not so keen on what seems to be Highlander beef between Amharas and Tigrayans, as things, um, as we've seen with the release of the Oromo political prisoners, the traditional centers of Ethiopian power emanating from the northern part of the country seems to be going away now. And we're seeing more of a southern Oromo, Pentecostal political base that is becoming more and more dominant. I mean, most of the generals now, I think, are Oromo. Abiy Ahmed himself is also Oromo, at least half. So for peace, I think the Tigrayan forces will try to probably take Western Tigray, and that's one of the big straddle points. How will the situation be with the Eritrean president, Isaias Afwerki, and his crew? I think is just a big sort of bone in the throat of the whole operation. I think due to his last speech, or his last lecture to the country a few weeks ago, I think he kind of mocked Abiy's sort of inability to withstand pressure from the West. And he's still hell bent on this sort of total destruction of the TPLF, in his words, game over for TPLF. That seems to be something that is really driving him. But as much as an eliminationist, I think Isaias Afwerki he is also at times a pragmatist. I mean, as you know, the major operation that kicked the Ethiopian forces out of Tigray in late June, Eritrean forces retreated days before that happened. They've seemingly been forming defensive positions along their border. So if Tigrayan forces make a serious and sincere attempt at Western Tigray, I imagine that Eritrean forces will again sort of restrain themselves and focus on border and protecting their shoring of their borders, because I don't think they're willing to take heavy losses for a territory that's not even theirs. I mean, this is a very poor country with just a few million people. How they have to be smart on how they use their resources, and I think he's shown the willingness to backstab his former comrades. Of course, he's going to backstab and abandon the Amhara regional government if they need help defending themselves. But I think much of the peace negotiations will be occurring outside of the country, namely Nairobi. I think Kenya has really stepped up and is going to become like an intermediary to both of the parties in this conflict. As you know, I mean, just a few weeks ago, Abiy had a call with Joe Biden himself, the president himself. So I think that definitely demonstrates a turning point. So we don't know where it's going to be held, but I think the issue of Western Tigray is key and essential of stalling this, whether Tigrayan forces take it back militarily or there's some type of deal that both sides can strike. But it doesn't seem, I think the most recalcitrant forces in this conflict are the Amhara regional government and also the PFDJ in Eritrea.
Well, let me ask you something that just occurred to me that may really upend the prospect for peace. What if the Abiy Ahmed-led government and the Isaias Afwerki-led government started to diverge? What if they started to turn against one another before they could finish their war? Because that's something that I don't think I've ever considered. I mean, they both have a similar objective in displacing the TPLF, but the reasons why they want to do it is different. And also the likeliness of them actually splitting and parting ways is growing, I would say, because the United States really wants to sanction Ethiopia, but they can't because of the economic uh, and political relationship that they've had for so long. But they can afford sanctioning Eritrea and isolating it internationally. What if Abiy is not able to convince the US that Eritrea is not a pariah state? And as a result, the regime in Asmara and the regime in Addis Ababa start to diverge out and they can't reconcile soon enough to defeat their common enemy.
Well, I think this has sort of been a game of chess, right? When Abiy rose to power, he had a lot of international acclaim, and he used the goodwill that he had to sort of convince the Security Council to rescind its arms embargo on Eritrea, right? I think he doesn't have that goodwill anymore, given how this war has occurred. So I think both sides are starting to realize how their interests are actually opposed to each other, right? The interest of Abiy is to sort of repair his image in the international community. I mean, he's a young leader. He's in his mid-40s. He's going to be the prime minister of the country for a very long time. So his relationships with the West and with donors are actually more important, both in the short and the long term, than his relationship with Isaias Afwerki, who provided assistance for him in the war, but quite frankly, that assistance wasn't enough. So I think he'll come to realize very quickly that his relationship with Isaias Afwerki has cost him more in the long run than it did in the short term, as they were not able to immediately crush the TPLF. I mean, with Isaias Afwerki, I know this is an old man. Who knows how many years he has left? I think, I think he's come to realize that Abiy is quite immature and is willing to sort of turn on his allies and not stick to their pact that they had. And I think that's what we're seeing now. So I don't know. I honestly don't know where this might head, but there's clearly some tension and some divergence, like you described.
And also, just to add, Abiy is willing to capitulate. You know, he essentially has a very strategic relationship as the Ethiopian prime minister with outside governments, and he's been given the good grace of the United Nations to end the war countless times. And he really, as you said, needs those agreements and relationships in order to sustain his authenticity and his image as a world leader. Whereas Isaias is kind of a pariah. He's a gangster, he runs a mafia of a government, and perhaps he can survive isolation and sanctions, but he cannot survive without key alliances and strategic partners. Even in the time of the TPLF leading the Ethiopian government, Isaias was working with others, including, as you said, Ethiopian opposition in Eritrea. He was training them. He worked with Omar al-Bashir in Sudan until it didn't fit his needs. He worked with Israel, which is something that many people don't realize, is that Eritrea and Israel, the governments of both countries are very close together, especially when it comes to security technology. So Isaias needs support. He needs them to really understand where he's coming from in terms of his continued power. Whereas Abiy exists in a society that is based off of democracy to an extent, and he's able to afford some losses as long as it's to his interest, and he can really continue to build on the Ethiopian relations with other countries. So I think you're right. I think both governments probably at some point will diverge whenever their interests are too polar or they become significant enough where they are just not compatible. And I don't say that as a hopeful thing. I say that actually as a pretty scary thing, because that was the same thing that happened between the EPLF and the TPLF. For a long time, they were collaborators when it came to overthrowing the Derg regime in Ethiopia. But unfortunately, due to their own conceited notions that they were the only parties uh, smart enough to rule their respective country, that eventually they start seeing each other as rivals. And as a result, they start to demonize people. And in our culture, unfortunately, guilt by association exists. So if you're Eritrean, well, from a Tigrayan standpoint, you must be a PFDJ member. Same with Eritrea. If you are a Tigrayan, you must be a TPLF member. And, assuming that over time, it can really start to build up. And you don't see it initially. At first, you say, oh, well, it's a few bad apples, or it's just one or two people. It's not the entirety of the country. But you can see very clearly that over the course of the conflict, crisis actors is a term that I've seen by many Ethiopian government supporters as a way to excuse the crimes in the government and also to deny that they're happening. I've seen many Ethiopian government supporters say that the crisis in Tigray is overblown or it's exaggerated, but that is clearly not the case. We have seen time and time again from multiple watchdogs and the United Nations that the crisis in Tigray is something that cannot be ignored. The humanitarian suffering is on par with what's happening in Yemen, to the extent that the acute malnutrition and lack of medicine has impacted the people of Tigray. It is such a devastating experience for these people that, by the way, they had no say in the elections. We could argue whether or not the elections in Tigray were legitimate or not, but the point is, ultimately, these parties are not going to immediately allow their civilian population to replace them. As you've seen, people like Getachew Reda, Debretsion, Gabriel Mikhail, these are people who have been in the party for years. They kind of want to keep their group the way it has been in order to survive, not even to just expand their ideology, but just to maintain themselves as an ideology, as a political entity in the region. And I bring that point up about Isaias and Abiy diverging because that is a real possibility. I don't know if it's likely, but it could happen, just based off of the examples of previous times in history, that governments will always look after their own self-interest ultimately. And as long as this war is helping Eritrea and Ethiopia, then it'll continue. As soon as there are reasons why either side needs to stop, they will do so. And I think at that point, we really should be cautious and to see whether peace is actually possible under these governments. Finally, I'd like to ask, as we're talking about peace and the possibility that it could happen in the region, what is it that you would like to see in order for peace to actually take place? What do you think um, people in your community, people in my community, we need to be focused on in order to have a better understanding about the circumstances for peace to occur? What does it need? And also, to what extent do you think we should all uh, respond to the immediate and the proximate issues of the crisis happening in Tigray? Of course, I'm including the humanitarian access, and also to an extent the issues of Western Tigray, um, and other political or policy issues. I'll say, what do you think those two issues need? How do they need to be addressed?
I think there needs to be a person-to-person, interpersonal dialogue. We talk a lot about the national dialogue and how that might lead to the end of the conflict, but the dialogue shouldn't solely be between political leaders. They need to be with people themselves. Similar to what South Africa had after apartheid, a sort of a truth and reconciliation process that needs to be held seriously amongst Eritreans, Tigrayans, Amharas, all the group. Everyone in the country needs to have a sort of a medium for them to do that. Um, I think I think we often like to blame political actors, people who have the power, but partially the reason some of them have power is because they have significant sayings, and they represent, for the most part, sort of you know significant constituencies and the sentiments that they might be feeling. Um, as you said, I mean, after the border war in Eritrea, it wasn't just the PFDJ that hated the TPLF. Most, I'm sure, I don't know how, you probably don't remember, but many Eritreans that rightfully, regardless of what they thought about the PFDJ, rightfully held the TPLF in contempt for for what went on. I mean, we saw the toppling of the Matara steel obelisk. We saw the desecration of the Martyrs Cemetery in, I think, Zorona. And that had a very, I think, significant effect um, amongst the Eritrean psyche, you know? So I think we need to have a sort of a medium, an interpersonal medium, because we can have all the national discussions we want. It can have a national discussion between Debretsion and Jawar Mohammed and Eskinder Nega and Abiy Ahmed, but ultimately the people need to be afforded that opportunity as well.
And I completely agree. I think all sides recognizing their crimes and their atrocities that they committed is probably the single most important issue, just for the sake of moving on and having closure. One of the things that I've continually witnessed is the denials of people as to the crimes that have been committed. And as you said, the border war was really a devastating and a very sad time for Eritreans who, I'm talking mostly about the civilian population, did not really have anything to do with the issues that led up to the border conflict. And as a result, they were desecrated. The memorials of the soldiers, the Tegadali, were completely destroyed. And that's something that needs to be admitted. But I think with the right people in charge, it can be a reconcilable issue. And Eritrean military is not completely innocent either. Just take a look at what's happened the past 14, 15 months at this point. The mass killings of Tigrayans at the Axum Saint Mary of Zion, cathedral was an absolute disgrace done in our name, as well as the killings of Eritrean refugees. How barbaric of a regime to kill its own civilian population who have had to flee because of persecution. And in addition, the Ethiopian government, which was supposed to protect these refugees, allowed the government from which these people had fled to come in and do it. I think, yes, I think in order to establish peace, we first have to admit that at some point, all of these parties have committed very serious crimes. And that may be hard to do, but it's a requirement in order for the next step. Asmerom, I'd like to give you the final word.
Every, hopefully the somewhat positive developments that we've been seeing and hearing over the past few weeks continue at a faster rate, because the faster this conflict comes to end, the better it is for the lives of millions of people, and not just in Tigray too. Hopefully we'll learn more news. If my hunch is correct, I expect more news to emerge this week, and let's keep hoping for that, and let's do our part in being informed citizens wherever we are, and contribute to a less toxic, more productive political culture.
Thank you.